The story of the Vietnam War is a long and complicated one. It did not begin with American soldiers, it began long before with the people of Vietnam wanting to rule their own country. For many years France had controlled Vietnam, but the Vietnamese people fought for their freedom. A man named Ho Chi Minh led this fight. He believed in communism and wanted a united, independent Vietnam. After a long war, the French were defeated in 1954. The country was supposed to hold elections to decide its future, but this never happened. Instead, an agreement was made to temporarily divide Vietnam into two parts. The division was meant to be short-term. The North was led by Ho Chi Minh and his communist government. The South was led by Ngo Dinh Diem, who was supported by the United States. The two sides had very different ideas about how the country should be run. The North wanted to reunite the country under one communist government. The South, with American help, wanted to remain separate and non-communist. This fundamental disagreement created a deep and lasting rift. It set the stage for a conflict that would grow far beyond Vietnam's borders, pulling in powerful nations from around the world. In the South, Diem's government faced many problems. Many people did not like his leadership. He was often seen as out of touch with the needs of the rural population. Groups of communist fighters in the South, known as the Viet Cong, began to resist his rule. They were supported by North Vietnam. The Viet Cong used guerrilla warfare tactics, hiding in the jungles and launching surprise attacks. They fought to overthrow the South Vietnamese government and reunite the country. This civil conflict grew more intense with each passing year, slowly but surely creating a situation that would require outside intervention. The United States watched this situation with growing concern. American leaders believed in something called the domino theory. They feared that if South Vietnam became communist, then other countries in Southeast Asia would also fall to communism, one after another, like a row of dominoes. This fear was a central part of the Cold War, the global struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. To prevent the spread of communism, America began sending money, equipment, and military advisors to help South Vietnam. This was the first small step in what would become a massive American commitment. The American role in Vietnam grew slowly at first, but it soon became much larger. In 1964, an event in the Gulf of Tonkin changed everything. The United States claimed that its naval ships had been attacked by North Vietnamese boats. This event led the U.S. Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This resolution gave President Lyndon B. Johnson the power to use military force in Vietnam without an official declaration of war. It was a pivotal moment. It opened the door for a massive increase in American involvement, transforming a regional conflict into a major international war that would define a generation. With this new authority, the United States began sending hundreds of thousands of soldiers to Vietnam. The first combat troops arrived in 1965. The goal was to support the South Vietnamese army and defeat the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese forces. The American military was powerful. With advanced technology, helicopters, and bombers, they launched major operations like Operation Rolling Thunder, a long bombing campaign against North Vietnam. The strategy was to use overwhelming firepower to force the enemy to give up. But the jungles of Vietnam were a difficult place to fight, and the enemy was determined. The war escalated quickly. By 1968, there were over 500,000 American troops in Vietnam. The fighting was intense and brutal. American soldiers went on search and destroy missions, trying to find and eliminate enemy fighters in the villages and jungles. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army, however, were experts at guerrilla warfare. They used tunnels, traps, and ambushes. They blended in with the local population, making it hard for American soldiers to know who was a friend and who was an enemy. This created an environment of constant fear and uncertainty for everyone involved. Back in the United States, support for the war began to weaken. At first, many Americans believed they were fighting for a good cause, to stop communism. But as the war dragged on, that view began to change. Television brought images of the fighting into American living rooms every night. People saw the violence and the suffering. They saw American soldiers dying. A strong anti-war movement grew across the country. People protested in the streets, on college campuses, and in Washington, D.C. The nation became deeply divided between those who supported the war and those who wanted it to end. Life for an American soldier in Vietnam was unlike anything they could have prepared for. The environment itself was an enemy. They faced sweltering heat, constant humidity, and heavy monsoon rains. The dense jungle terrain was filled with dangers, from venomous snakes to hidden booby traps. Soldiers carried heavy packs on long patrols through rice paddies and thick forests, never knowing when an attack might come. The enemy was often invisible, striking quickly from hidden positions and then disappearing back into the landscape. The stress was immense, a constant state of high alert that wore down even the strongest individuals. The Vietnamese people, both in the north and the south, suffered tremendously during the war. Their homeland became the battlefield, villages were destroyed, and farm fields were ruined by bombs and chemical agents like Agent Orange, which was used to clear the jungle foliage. Millions of civilians were caught in the crossfire. They had to flee their homes, becoming refugees in their own country. Life was a daily struggle for survival. It was often impossible to tell who was fighting for which side, and civilians were at risk from all of them. The war tore families and communities apart, leaving scars that would last for generations. The war was also fought in the minds of the American people. For the first time in history, a war was broadcast on television. Nightly news reports showed graphic footage from the front lines. This unfiltered access to the realities of combat had a profound impact. It challenged the official government reports that often spoke of progress and light at the end of the tunnel. Many Americans began to question the war's purpose and its morality. The difference between what leaders in Washington said and what people saw on their screens created a credibility gap, leading to widespread distrust of the government. A major turning point came in 1968 with the Tet Offensive. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong launched a massive surprise attack on cities and towns all across South Vietnam. Militarily, the attack was a failure for the communists, as they were eventually beaten back with heavy losses. But politically, it was a stunning blow to the United States. It showed that the enemy was much stronger and more determined than the American public had been led to believe. The Tet Offensive shattered the idea that the war was being won, and support for the conflict plummeted. It marked the beginning of the end of America's commitment. After the shock of the Tet Offensive, the United States began to look for a way out of Vietnam. President Richard Nixon was elected in 1968 with a promise to end the war. His plan was called Vietnamization. The idea was to gradually withdraw American troops while training and equipping the South Vietnamese army to take over the fighting on their own. At the same time, the U.S. expanded its bombing campaigns in secret, even into neighboring countries like Cambodia, hoping to force North Vietnam to negotiate. It was a complex and often contradictory strategy, trying to leave the war while also trying to win it. Peace talks had been going on in Paris for years, but they made little progress. Finally, in January 1973, a peace agreement was signed. The Paris Peace Accords called for a ceasefire and the complete withdrawal of all American troops. By March 1973, the last U.S. combat soldiers had left Vietnam. For America, the war was over, but for the Vietnamese people, the fighting did not stop. The ceasefire was quickly broken, and the war between North and South Vietnam resumed. The United States continued to send money and supplies, but it would not send soldiers back. Without American military support, the South Vietnamese army could not hold back the North. In the spring of 1975, North Vietnam launched a final, massive offensive. The South Vietnamese forces collapsed quickly. On April 30, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into the southern capital of Saigon. The war was finally over. Saigon was renamed Ho Chi Minh City, and Vietnam was officially reunited as a single communist country. The domino theory that had driven so much of American policy did not come true in the way that was feared, but the cost of the war was enormous. The Vietnam War left a deep and lasting legacy. More than 58,000 Americans were killed, and many more were wounded in body and mind. The war created deep divisions in American society that took decades to heal. For Vietnam, the cost was even greater. Millions of Vietnamese soldiers and civilians from both the North and the South lost their lives. The country was devastated by bombs and chemical weapons, and it faced a long, difficult path to recovery. The war remains a powerful and painful memory for both nations, a reminder of the tragic human cost of conflict.